It was a warm September afternoon in Redwood Oaks, a quiet suburb tucked among California's hills, the kind of day when the sun still carries summer's warmth, but the breeze whispers of autumn's approach. The front yard of my daughter's house was strung with balloons and ribbons, tables lined with cakes, cookies, and bright drinks. Children's laughter spilled out across the street. Today was my grandson's 5th birthday. I walked slowly up the stone path, holding in my hands the gift I had worked on for weeks, a small oak bench I'd carved myself in my garage workshop. It was simple, but every curve and smooth edge held the memory of patience, sweat, and care. I imagined my grandson sitting on it during the long summer evenings, listening to stories, or my daughter setting flower pots on it, a small piece of something lasting, made by hand, not bought. At the gate, the neighborhood security guard from the homeowners association gave me a polite nod and let me through. He knew me well. I'd lived here most of my life. The yard was already filled with guests, neighbors, co-workers, friends of my son-in-law. Their laughter mixed with the hum of pop music coming from the speakers. My son-in-law, tall and polished in his navy suit, noticed me first. His smile was thin, stretched tight like tape. "What's this?" he said loudly, his voice cutting through the chatter as he pointed at the bench. "Some old-fashioned furniture." The laughter around us quieted. A few people turned away awkwardly, pretending to look at the buffet table. I started to explain that I'd made it myself, that the oak was solid and would last decades, but he cut me off, his tone deliberately sharp. "We've got a modern house, remember? Not some rustic cabin. That thing doesn't belong here. Take it back, please." The word thing hit harder than I expected. I wanted to tell him that wood was alive, that it breathed, that it held warmth and memory. But the words stuck in my throat. He turned toward the entrance. "Security," he called. "Can you help Mr. Miller here with his delivery?" At first I thought I misheard. But the guards stepped forward, polite, professional, their eyes avoiding mine. Around us the party continued, music, laughter, the sound of a bottle opening. I held the bench tighter, not to resist, but to keep from losing what little dignity I had left. When they led me back through the gate, I turned once. The celebration went on as if nothing had happened. My daughter stood by the porch beside her husband. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and then she looked away. I lowered my gaze and walked down the street toward my small house, the converted guest cottage at the edge of the property. It had been my home ever since Mary, my wife, passed away. Humiliation doesn't shout. It settles quietly inside you, heavy and cold. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as one thought circled endlessly in my mind: how easily a man can be erased from the very home he once built with his own hands. Inside my little workshop, the smell of oak and varnish lingered. I set the bench down by the door and sat beside it. My hands trembled, not from age, but from the sting of what had just happened. I'd carved that gift with the same tools I'd used years ago to build the beams of the very house my daughter lived in now. Every groove in the wood carried the patience and care I'd once poured into her childhood home. I could still see her running barefoot through the halls I'd framed, laughing as her mother called her in for dinner. Back then, I'd stand at the doorway, proud, knowing every plank, every stair, every nail had come from these hands. It wasn't just a house. It was my life's work. Years ago, when my daughter finished high school, I sold the small plot of land I still owned up in Mendocino, the last thing truly mine, so she could go to college debt-free. Later, when she married Daniel, I gave them the rest of my savings for the down payment on this house. "Start your family with ease," I told them. Daniel had shaken my hand firmly back then, called me Dad, promised he'd take care of her. Promises fade when comfort grows. After Mary passed, the big house felt empty. So I moved into the guest house I'd built behind it decades earlier, 2 rooms, a small stove, a workbench. It was simple, but enough. I could hear my grandson playing in the yard, see the kitchen lights at night. That light meant I wasn't alone. But over the years, something changed. Daniel began to look at me not as family, but as an inconvenience. "Dad," he said one evening, leaning against the marble counter with a glass of bourbon, "don't you think it's time you considered moving into a retirement community? You'd have company. Activities. People your age." "This is my home," I said quietly. "I built this place with my own hands. The guest house included." He chuckled softly. "You and your stories, Tom. Times change." That night I realized, he didn't see me as family anymore, only as a shadow clinging to what he believed was his. When he called my bench junk, it wasn't about wood. It was about me, about erasing the man who had built the foundation he now stood on. And my daughter, she hadn't said a word. Maybe she was afraid. Or maybe years of Daniel's persuasion had taught her to see me as a burden too. What hurt wasn't the insult itself, but the truth behind it. I had given everything, and still, I'd become unwelcome. I looked at Mary's photograph above my workbench. Did I do wrong? I whispered. In giving so much, did I forget to keep enough for myself? The silence answered me. That night I barely slept. The laughter from the house drifted faintly through the trees, each note a reminder that I no longer belonged inside. I sat at my bench sharpening my old chisels, the rhythmic scrape of steel against stone steadying my hands. And then, quietly, I said aloud, "Enough." It wasn't anger that filled me, it was clarity. If I stayed silent any longer, I would vanish completely from this family's story. And so I decided, it was time to remind them, not with anger, not with shouting, but with truth, of who I was, and what this house truly stood on. A few days passed before Daniel showed up again. I was sanding a cabinet door in my workshop when the latch clicked and the door swung open without a knock. His cologne arrived before he did, something expensive, sharp, the kind that filled the air like an announcement. "Tom," he said, voice smooth but cold. "We need to talk." I didn't look up. "Then talk." He stepped closer, dropping a neat folder on the workbench. Papers spread across the wood, notarized pages, bank seals, and a signature line marked with a bright yellow tab. "I've got an opportunity," he began. "The bank's offering a major line of credit. It'll help me expand my company, new offices, bigger contracts. All I need is your signature here, to include the property as collateral." I stopped sanding and looked at him. "Collateral? You mean a mortgage?" He smiled, that half-polite, half-condescending kind of smile. "Not a mortgage. Leverage. It's just paperwork, Dad. A formality." The word "dad" sounded wrong in his mouth. It had the texture of habit, not respect. "No," I said. He blinked, surprised. "No. I won't sign. This house isn't a bargaining chip." He sighed, straightening his cufflinks. "Tom, you're standing in the way of your daughter's future, of your grandson's future. Don't you want them to have more than this?" He gestured around the small workshop, as if the walls themselves were proof of my limitations. "I built these walls," I said quietly. "And I built theirs. What I want is for them to keep it." Daniel's tone hardened. "You think that guest house is yours forever? You're here because I let you stay. Don't test my patience." That did it. I set down the sandpaper slowly, deliberately, and stood up. "You let me stay," I said, keeping my voice calm. "I poured the foundation for that house before you ever met my daughter. The guest house, this very room, was framed by my hands. You don't let me stay anywhere, Daniel. I belong here." His expression shifted from irritation to anger. "You can romanticize sawdust all you want, old man. But times have changed. People build wealth now, not walls." He turned sharply and walked out, the door slamming behind him. I stood there for a long time, listening to the faint hum of the cicadas outside. Then I went to the small cabinet near my workbench and pulled out a wooden box. Inside it were fragments of another life, old photographs, Mary's wedding ring, yellowed envelopes, and folders that smelled faintly of time and ink. That box was my second memory, Mary used to call it that. And buried at the bottom, folded and sealed, I found what I was looking for. The deed. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but the words were still clear. Years ago, when I transferred ownership of the property to my daughter so she and Daniel could qualify for a mortgage, the document had included one key clause, something Mary had insisted we add before signing. The guest house located at the eastern edge of the property shall remain the lifelong residence of Thomas Miller and may not be sold, mortgaged, or transferred under any circumstance. Mary had been wiser than I. She'd known I might need protection long after she was gone. That night I placed the document on the table beside her photograph and whispered, "You thought ahead, didn't you?" The candlelight flickered across her face in the picture, the same smile she'd worn the day we finished building the annex together. Relief mixed with grief. She had saved me again, even from beyond the grave. Still, I knew Daniel. He was clever with words and public opinion. He'd twist the story until neighbors believed I was stubborn, outdated, even selfish. A piece of paper wouldn't be enough, I needed witnesses and clarity. So the next morning, I made a call. "Michael Carter speaking," came a familiar voice. "Mike," I said softly. "It's Tom Miller." A pause, then warmth flooded through the line. "Tom. Jesus, it's been years. You still working that shop of yours?" "Every day," I said. "But I need a favor, and not a small one." I told him everything. There was silence, then a slow exhale on the other end. "Bring the deed," he said. "Tomorrow. And Tom, don't let pride turn into shame. This isn't about ego. It's about keeping what's yours." The next morning I drove across town to Michael's small law office in San Mateo. The building smelled of coffee and old wood, a familiar scent that steadied me. Michael, gray-haired now but still sharp-eyed, spread the deed across his desk, adjusting his glasses. "This clause," he said finally, tapping the page. "It's solid. Ironclad. As long as you're alive, they can't touch that guest house. If they try, the law will crush them. But Tom, listen carefully, you can't keep this quiet. When the time comes, you show it publicly. Let people see the truth. That way, lies can't grow." I nodded. "I'm done hiding." He smiled faintly. "That's the carpenter I remember." When I left his office, the afternoon sun was golden, spilling across the streets. I felt lighter than I had in years, not because the fight was over, but because I finally knew where I stood. Over the next few days, I prepared quietly. I talked to neighbors, old friends who'd been there when I first built the house decades ago. People who remembered me hauling lumber in the California heat, back when Daniel was still a stranger to this place. "Tom," one of them said, clapping me on the shoulder, "if that boy tries to take what's yours, we'll stand beside you. Everyone here knows whose hands built that home." Each word was like a nail securing a beam, steady, firm, unyielding. At night, I'd sit by my bench, the oak gift still leaning against the wall. The same bench Daniel had called junk. I ran my fingers along the smooth grain and realized it had become more than a gift, it was a symbol. Not of what I'd lost, but of what I still held, dignity, memory, truth. That evening, I sharpened my pencil, laid out fresh paper, and wrote a title across the top. "What Must Be Remembered." Under it, I began listing everything that built this home, every sacrifice, every promise, every name that deserved to remain part of its story. Because remembering wasn't enough anymore. It was time to make others remember too. It was a Sunday evening, the kind that smelled of barbecue smoke and cooling grass. Daniel called everyone together for what he called a family meeting. His tone, sharp and performative, carried through the whole house. "We'll meet in the living room after dinner," he said, as though he were hosting a corporate briefing, not a family talk. By the time I arrived, the room was already filled. Daniel had invited not just my daughter and grandson, but a few of his business partners, neighbors, and even the family from across the street, the kind of audience a man like him always wanted. My daughter sat stiffly on the sofa, her hands clasped, her face pale with tension. Daniel stood in the center of the room, confident as ever. His voice carried easily, polished and controlled. "Friends," he began, "thank you for coming. I wanted you all here because I value transparency." He paused, letting the word hang in the air like a performance cue. "I've been presented with an opportunity to expand my company, something that could secure my family's future. But, unfortunately," he sighed dramatically and looked toward me. "Not everyone shares my vision." Murmurs stirred around the room. I could feel the weight of the gazes turning toward me, curious, cautious. Daniel held up a document, shaking it lightly. "All I need is one signature, one simple act of cooperation, and we could turn this property into something far greater. But my father-in-law refuses. He's standing in the way of his own grandson's future." The silence thickened. The performance was perfect, the visionary entrepreneur, blocked by the stubborn relic of another time. I stood slowly, letting the hush settle. My hand rested on the back of a chair to steady myself. "No," I said quietly, but firmly. "I'm standing in the way of greed disguised as progress." A ripple of whispers spread. Daniel's smile faltered. He turned to me. "Then explain yourself, Tom. Tell everyone here why you'd rather hold us back than let us move forward." I reached into my folder, the same one I'd carried for days, and drew out the deed. The paper, old but clear, caught the light from the chandelier. I held it up so everyone could see. "This house," I said, "was built by my hands. And when I transferred ownership to my daughter years ago, it was with one condition, that this guest house, my home, remain mine for life." I passed the deed to Michael Carter, who stood quietly among the guests, just as we'd planned. He adjusted his glasses and read aloud, his voice steady. "The guest house located at the eastern edge of the property shall remain the lifelong residence of the donor, Thomas Miller, and may not be sold, mortgaged, or transferred under any circumstance." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Daniel's face flushed crimson. "That's outdated," he snapped. "It doesn't apply anymore. The bank doesn't care about." Michael interrupted calmly. "The law does. This document is still binding, Daniel. If you attempt to mortgage this property, the bank will reject it. And if you try to evict Mr. Miller, you'll be violating California state law. I'd advise against it." A murmur spread through the room. Daniel's composure cracked, his jaw tightened. He looked around, realizing the performance had turned against him. I stepped forward, my voice low but carrying through the space. "I didn't want this," I said. "All I wanted was respect, the kind that comes from truth. I'm not standing in the way of my grandson's future. I'm protecting it. Because a home built on debt and pride can collapse overnight. But a home built on care, on honesty, and on sacrifice, that stands." My daughter's eyes filled with tears. Her hands trembled in her lap. Around her, the guests stayed silent, the weight of the moment pressing on all of us. Daniel tried to speak again, but the words failed him. He set the papers down on the table and left the room without another word. For a long time, no one moved. Then my daughter stood and crossed the room to me. "Dad," she whispered, voice shaking, "I didn't know. You never told me." I looked at her, her eyes red, her shoulders bowed with years of compromise. "I didn't want you to live with that burden," I said. "The deed wasn't a weapon. It was protection, for me, for you, for what your mother and I built." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "He said you were holding us back." I believed him. She took my hand. "But it was you who kept us from losing everything." Her words hit me harder than Daniel's insults ever could. Because they carried truth, and regret. The days after that meeting were quiet, almost unnaturally so. Daniel stopped speaking to me entirely. He avoided me in the yard, his footsteps quick and clipped. His pride had taken a blow deeper than I'd intended. Word traveled through the neighborhood faster than either of us expected. People whispered, not cruelly but knowingly. "Tom built that house himself," they said. And they tried to push him out. Others spoke more quietly, "Daniel's loan fell through. The bank wouldn't touch the property." In a town like ours, reputations crumble not with scandal, but with silence. For me, life found its rhythm again. The days grew cooler, the leaves turning copper and red. I repaired the hinges on the guesthouse door, replaced a few shingles, polished the bench I'd made, the one that had started it all. One afternoon, my grandson wandered over while I worked. He was carrying a toy truck, his sneakers scattering dry leaves across the path. "Grandpa," he asked, climbing onto the bench, "why was Daddy mad at you?" I paused, setting down my screwdriver. "Sometimes, buddy," I said softly, "people forget what really matters. They think money builds a home. But it's love, and respect, that keep it standing." He nodded solemnly, then smiled and began rolling his truck along the carved patterns on the bench. And just like that, the gift found its purpose. That evening, my daughter came by. She didn't knock, she just stepped inside, her face tired but peaceful. She sat at the small kitchen table where Mary and I had once shared coffee and whispered dreams of our daughter's future. "Dad," she said, "I can't undo what's happened. But I want to make it right." I shook my head. "You already did. You saw the truth. That's enough." She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "You always said wood remembers its maker. I think people do too, eventually." We sat in silence for a while, watching the light fade through the window. It was the same sunset I'd seen from this spot 1,000 times, but this one felt different. Softer. Honest. Weeks passed. Daniel kept to himself, his business deals shrinking into smaller talk. He no longer threw loud parties or hosted investors in the backyard. Pride had folded into quiet retreat. But my daughter and grandson came often. We fixed the garden fence together, oiled the porch railings, planted new roses. The house that once echoed with tension now felt alive again, humbler, but real. One crisp morning, my grandson and I placed the oak bench by the porch steps. He climbed up, swinging his legs, sunlight catching his hair. "This is our bench, Grandpa," he said proudly. I smiled, my throat tightening. "Yes," I said. "Ours." Neighbors would stop me on the sidewalk now and then. Some offered polite nods, others quiet words. "You did the right thing, Tom," one man said. "You reminded all of us what family really means." I never answered with pride. I just nodded. Because this wasn't victory, it was balance. One evening, as the light faded and the air smelled faintly of rain, my daughter sat beside me on the bench. We watched my grandson chase fireflies across the yard. "Dad," she said softly, "you were right. A house without respect is just walls." I placed my hand gently over hers. "Respect's like wood," I told her. "Strong when you care for it, but if you neglect it, it rots. Keep it alive, for him." We sat there in quiet understanding as night settled. The house behind us glowed with soft light. The guest house stood firm beside it, not just a shelter, but a testament. And I realized then, dignity doesn't shout. It doesn't need applause. It stands silently, like a beam inside the frame of a house, unseen, but holding everything above it.